Okay, so I put up a story kind of asking what people wanted to see as far as videos because I can never come up with what to talk about. So one of the ones that I thought was a very easy answer that is something I believe strongly in is what is the importance of reduced equipment training, right? So at various points in your training, taking off a given piece of equipment on the main motions, what is the benefit? So kind of top up, you could say, oh, there's benefit to taking off your shoes. If you squat in flats, squatting without any shoes on is just going to be a real honesty check for your foot mechanics, whether your feet are active, whether your arch is collapsed and your foot's pronating, or whether you're actually having active feet. It's just going to make it easier to feel whether that's happening, and to some degree it'll correct errors without you having to put an excessive amount of thought into it, just because it is going to like highlight errors you're making when you can feel the floor a little better. And if you squat in heels, I believe it's very important to be able to squat have a technically proficient squat with or without them, to really warrant using them. I think that people who could not do a good squat to depth with the heels on are probably missing out. I do believe heels are better for some people's leverages, but that doesn't mean you should need them to do a technically proficient squat, right? So taking those off, both for muscular development reasons to make sure your posterior chain and your hips are adequately strong, but also just because you need to have that fundamental understanding of the motion before you start introducing another variable such as heels. Sleeves are one that I don't take off a lot less often, and it has a lot more to do with just double checking, making sure you're keeping tension in your hips, because a lot of people nowadays will get their sleeves very early in their training careers, and your squat feels much better in sleeves. Everyone's does for the most part. And you can almost put that as a crutch, and you can rely heavily on your sleeves as you hit the hole, and it can almost mask whether you're keeping sufficient tightness in your hips. So taking those off is a good check for your hip tightness, and it's also a good way, having like a reasonable amount of strength, like a good ability to squat to depth without your sleeves on at an okay percentage, is also a really good insurance for healthy knees, right? Because if you can squat with your knee, like you have sufficient quad strength, sufficient stability, the ligaments are strong enough to squat pain-free without sleeves on, you're going to be feeling great at high percentages with sleeves for the most part. So I do think that definitely does have merit. The next one would probably be the belt, right? I think this is one of the most misunderstood ones. So yes, you can say, oh, EMG shows higher core activation with the belt on. I'm not actually missing out on any muscular gains. Yes and no. That spike in interabdominal pressure could lower the demands of your spinal erectors. So, if you squatted without a belt, your spinal erectors would likely be stronger, though your abs might not be. But that's not primarily the reason I would have someone take it off. I would take it off because I think some people genuinely just don't understand how to brace, because they do all of their bracing with a belt on. They understand that they're pushing air out to create interabdominal pressure, but what they think is they're just pushing into a belt. So you take off the belt, their bracing could be shit, and they're going to have a very proportionally low beltless squat or deadlift. And so learning how to flex your abs and push out against that in addition to the belt, which is how you should be bracing, will be just that much better when you put it back on. So I wouldn't take that heavy on squats or deadlifts bar sumo. So I wouldn't take it heavy on a low bar squat, and I would not take it heavy on a conventional deadlift. I just think the risk to reward ratio is just a little bit off. Taking sumo as heavy without a belt has made me much more technically proficient. A lot of people a lot more technically proficient with their mechanics, and I think that is something worth investigating. As far as other equipment, elbow sleeves, if you're a competitive powerlifter, I think they should be used extremely sparingly, if never. I would almost just universally recommend against them. You don't get them in competition, and there's things you can do to keep your elbows healthy outside of that external aid that is better than what you get in competition. And then wrist wraps is a really good honesty check for, as far as squatting goes. Squatting without wrist wraps is a good way to check if your mechanics are sound and you don't have a ton of weight in your hands, which would likely lead to bicep or elbow tendonitis at the heavier loads. If you go to squat without your wrist wraps on, and you are bearing a fair amount of load in your hands, you're going to feel it in your wrists very quickly. So it's a good kind of honesty check. I wouldn't really push that number and risk hurting your wrists, but it is a good way to know where you're at as far as getting weight out of your hands in the low bar squat. And as far as bench, it's a great way to check whether you're gripping the bar, whether the bar is set sufficiently low in your hand. If you can't bench a good weight pain-free without your wrist wraps on, you need to toss the wrist wraps for a while and learn how to actually grip the bar and set it in a place in your hand where it's not excessively hard to stabilize, right? That's a big one. Is like you dampen the feeling of your hands so much by cranking those on there that you might not even notice a notable technical error you're making. I've seen people put like 20, 30 pounds. I myself put 20, 30 pounds on my bench in a singular block just by throughout the block getting my grip better and better, and that led to better and better rep PRs correlating to a better max. And then I guess the latter part of this video would be how to implement reduced equipment, right? And I would say for the most part you have, I would say, three major ways you can implement it, right? The smallest scale intervention is just delaying further and further when you put on a piece of equipment. You know, it's a slippery slope because you don't want to do all your warm-ups without sleeves and then switch to sleeves at your top weight, because that's going to be a different motor pattern. You want to practice like you play. But I see a lot of people going full equipment right away, and I don't know if that's always the best thing to do. There's certainly the practice aspect, but also like how much practice are you getting out of a one plate squat that you can't get to depth, right? May as well warm up your knees a little bit better and leave them off, right? So that would be the simplest one, is progressing like the weight at which you put on things. Because a lot of people will be in that same boat where they've had that point where they put on the wrist wraps the same since they benched 100 pounds less. That should go up with your max most likely, right? So that's the smallest scale intervention. The one scale up, if it's something that's really addressing a weakness for you, would be using the reduced equipment as a variation. So maybe I'll have a beltless squat day or a no sleeves day, right? Or if I squat in heels, maybe I'll have a flat low bar day as well if I can recover from that. And that would be the next deviation up. You're committing a lot more of your training time to this deviation away from the competition motion because you've said that it addresses a significant error or weakness, right? And then you would have the biggest change, which would be doing an entire block without a piece of equipment. This holds value in the off season away from competition as a way to reduce load and let yourself rest a little bit. So if I come off a competition and I was going to bench, if I competed, I might do the entire next block without my wrist wraps on. I benefit greatly from my wrist wraps, which is probably a good sign that I should be doing more work without them. And I might spend that whole next block without them on. Maybe my results would be slightly decreased, but because it's an off season, my primary focuses are just accumulating volume, putting on muscle. I would say that result would be negligible, and it would be a time well spent, right? I would be really careful with this. You need to be very confident that this is something you need to address, and you're not expecting to crush an all-time PR without it, because I've seen it many times where people will just leave their belt off for an entire block, and what will happen is they just get really proficient at squatting without a belt, because to some degree using the belt is absolutely a skill. And while the skill of bracing without the belt might improve, the skill of bracing with the belt might decay, right? So that's sometimes people will be really caught off guard. They're like, oh, my beltless max went up 40 pounds, but my belted max didn't budge. Probably doing a beltless block was not what you needed to be doing, right? You probably had sufficient strength in your trunk. You should have been focusing on the strength in your legs, right? Oversimplification, but nonetheless, like, that's an error I see a lot. And that would be a more extreme intervention that I certainly think has its place, especially if you're just mentally burned out and you want an excuse to go light. Try just ditching all your equipment for a block on the squat. That's something Dan Green does frequently, is, when he starts over a big, like, he's got these waves of like a singular exercise, but he's got a progression across squats where he reintroduces equipment, as far as I can tell, right? And he reverts back to when he's going back in like that initial building phase. It's high bar with no equipment on, no belt, no sleeves, no shoes. I find that if I do something similar to that, my ankles get a lot healthier, my knees get a lot healthier, my mechanics get a lot better and more sound, because I'm not dampening my feeling for positions with things that are like really putting pressure on my body, right? I think it's something worthwhile that should be done at some point, especially if it's something you really struggle with. I think it's an oversimplification to say that you should do the things that you're bad at, because that's not always true. It might be bad, not because it's a weakness, but because just like based on your anthropometrics, it might just be bad for you, right? That's perfectly reasonable. But as far as equipment reduction goes, it's usually a good sign. If something's really, really rough, it might be worth dedicating some time to. This video is a little bit incoherent. I didn't really plan it out beforehand. I apologize if I rambled at all.